Welcome back to another Pen Talk. Thank you very much for tuning in, joining me as I explore this unbelievable, amazing, wide world of pens that we are very fortunate to be able to partake in. And you see one interesting example being held up by Baby Buddha. We haven't seen Baby Buddha for a while, but I think this was the perfect pen for him to display for your enjoyment. So let's take a look at this pen in some detail, talk about how it arrived to me, and we're going to compare it against some other interesting vintage pens. So this is a vintage pen video. A lot of people like them. So the first thing you notice about this pen is it's small. And as I said, we're going to compare it to some other small vintage pens. The celluloid material is really beautiful. And that's what really attracted me to this pen originally. One of my viewers asked about a pen that I reviewed many years ago and whether it was something I would be willing to trade for, and I said certainly. So this is one of the pens he offered me to trade. We made the trade, and I'm a happy customer. The cap comes off in less than one turn, and you'll see a small branded 14 karat nib. It's a Stilus. I did some research. I'll show you a little bit of detail about their history. The other thing that is kind of typical of some of these Italian pens from the 30s is like Parker did with many pens. It's a button filler. Previous owner put a new sack in, so we'll be able to ink it up. It's small in the hand. That section is tiny, and one would expect from this classic balanced design. It posts nicely, no weight changes whatsoever. It feels fine. This is definitely a pen that you're going to want to post. Let's compare it to some other pens. So this is pretty much as I received the pen. I did a little bit of polish to bring out some shine to the metal bits, but I noticed that this cap band here is loose and it does come off. But to me, that's an easy thing to remedy. We'll clean it up a little bit, put a little bit of glue on there, put it in place, let it set overnight, and it'll be as good as new. But that's vintage for you. There's always a little bits of things that, after almost 100 years, need a little bit of tender loving care. So I assembled these 4 pens, just because you haven't seen most of them. This is the one I reviewed a few months ago, Conway Stewart. Beautiful celluloid, excellent writer. It's been inked up and in use since the day I got it. Of course, here's the Stilus, and here's just a no brand name. And here's a Packard, very interesting material here. You notice the length of this is similar in the same vein. Of course, this is the smallest, but this is a very girthy pen. There was a lot of variations in designs in vintage pens. This is just a few examples. So all these pens post very well. And the length of the Conway Stewart is now the longest of this group. They all also have very small, but all 14 karat gold nibs, ebonite feeds, your typical vintage pen of these eras. A short section, very common. These are on the small side, but still usable. Come on, most of us of my age grew up with pencils and Bic stick pens, and so therefore these are all girthier than those writing instruments. Here we are with a close-up look at those sections and those nibs. This is the longest exposed nib of this group. All these nibs are a little soft. The tines spread with a little bit of pressure. They're all typical vintage gold nibs in my experience. So here are 2 examples of vintage pens that have the same material, but 2 different interpretations, 2 different designs. This is more classical bullet nose, Schaefer balance design. This is a Kritzler, and this is a Packard. There's a fair number of Packards in my collection. This is my first and only Kritzler that I'm aware of. And Troy LaPlante did a review of this pen. I'll give you a link. Interesting review. His experience has some downsides to it, but, you know, I bought a lot on eBay, and I've been happy with 99% of what I bought. I think these two pens also go to show you that exclusivity was also something that wasn't part of the vintage pen market back in the days, when there were hundreds of manufacturers of pens, many brand names, and everybody had to have a fountain pen because that was the best way to write. So what ink to put in a stylus? Well, I wanted it in the brown family, and this is definitely in the brown family, the dark brown family. Interesting to see how it works in the pen. So filling out of this bottle with the small button filler was a challenging and frustrating experience. Number one, I had to put the pen all the way down, and number two, the button was hard to press down. I bent the nib, but thankfully, with a little effort, I was able to restore the nib to its usual shape. I did it very slowly with a wooden dowel, so be careful with button fillers. They're not my most popular filling system. Wow, the nib works fine. For a small gold nib, it opens up well, as much as a very small nib is going to open up. Phenomenal ink flow, which is also very typical of these pens, these vintage pens. Gold nibs, ebonite feeds, probably has just a huge channel bringing ink from the latex sac down to the nib. Feels good on paper, not quite as smooth as my Conway Stewart nib, but then those nibs are generally pretty good. But it's still a nice writer, but the size of that pen makes it a challenging pen to write with. So it's a quick review of a vintage pen, a little bit of discussion of vintage. We'll give you some dimensions just to put things in perspective, because it is a small pen. So I wouldn't recommend vintage to everybody who wants to explore fountain pens. You have to have patience. You also need a pretty good education and understanding of vintage pens and how to write with them, how they work. You might see this in a eBay listing and go, wow, beautiful pen. Be careful about the dimensions, because most vintage pens are on the small side. There are some larger ones, but they're generally very expensive. With the size, the price goes up exponentially. But they're still fun. I enjoy mine, and I'm really glad to add this example of a interesting, small Italian pen maker, and one of, I think, a very good example of the pens that they made. We're going to do a sign-off and call it a day. Yep, it still flexes nicely. As I get used to the pen, it's easier to write with. And that's one of the things that I find is more of a trait of vintage pens than it is modern pens with steel nibs. I don't have any technical explanation for why that's the case, but it just seems to be the case. Maybe you get used to the pen, maybe the pen gets used to you. Whatever it is, it makes the writing experience unique and interesting. I hope this video finds everyone safe, healthy, and happy. I'd like to thank everyone for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little way back visit to a vintage pen, which is fairly rare, and I enjoy sharing it with you. So with that, we've reached the end of this video. Yep, now almost as good as my Conway Stewart on paper. So we will say bye. Well done.